Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay. So, as introduced, I am Mukesh Kumar, Global Technology Director, and today we're going to talk about additive manufacturing, overcoming fatigue strength hurdles in orthopedic implants. Now, to be honest, when I was asked to come up with a topic and help select a panel, I was not expecting this crowd. So thank you for coming, right? So either the draw is the topic or the draw is the panel, right? So, but thank you for coming. It's interesting, it's good to see. So without much ado, let's introduce the topic and introduce why and how we are going to do this. So I'm just going to introduce the topic. Now I'm with Lincotech. I deal with a lot of OEMs who have issues with additive. We try to solve their problem. The more and more I hear about their problem, the more I think this is a very pertinent topic for all of them, right? So the way I would like to do is I introduce the topic, then the speakers will talk, write down your questions. At the end of the day, I will have questions for the panelists. I hope you all will have questions for the panelists, and together we will make it a very lively, entertaining, and learning session. Okay. So at Lincotech, we have two groups of additive. The additive medical that I lead and additive non-medical. But everywhere we go, when titanium is involved, we always hear about, as an industry perception, additive parts are weak. First statement. Second statement, additive parts are weak in fatigue, okay? Second statement. And then many OEMs want to shy away from additive, or they think that it is going to be a very long path through regulatory or testings or whatever, right? And they are looking at doing their product, new innovative ideas, the old traditional way. So with this, and the more I talk to them, the more I realize that many of them don't even realize that the FDA has put in a lot of guidance document. There are ASTM standards that can help them walk through this potential hurdle, right? So as you go around and as you talk to people, remember that there is a very nice FDA guidance document, right? If you don't know what it is, if I'm walking around, ask all of them, they'll help you out with that, okay? But the current status is what? Currently in the industry, there are a lot of acetabular cups, there are a lot of spine cages, right? But what is it missing? It is missing implants, in my mind at least, missing or in a very reduced way, implants which are high risk implants, high risk in fatigue, right? So as I was asked to think of a topic, I thought this is something that would be interesting for the team to talk about, and therefore select a panel that could walk you through all this. So let's look at this. Like I said, the industry leaders, FDA, ASTM, we don't need to go through all this, but if you look at the ASTM standards around additive, the first perception that, I was trying to get the laser pointer, but I can't see, it doesn't matter. We don't need to go through this line by line, but the first perception that mechanically additive parts are weak is absolutely incorrect. At least from a strength perspective, they're as strong as ASTM 136 parts, wrought titanium, right? So absolutely dispel that. However, I will be the first one to admit, when you're doing fatigue strength tests, traditional fatigue strength tests, rotating beam fatigue strength tests, you will find that it is much lower than traditional wrought material. Much lower than traditional wrought material, which may have maybe sinter beads, maybe plasma spray, depending on how the parts were done, right? And that could be because of microstructure, surface roughness, surface notches, right? Microporosity, other things that could happen. However, that doesn't say that you cannot design around that. There are people who are actually doing that today. There are people who should be thinking about how to do that today. So with that in idea, how do we overcome certain limitations, right? So the way we have organized this panel is John will talk about design. John has some experience, quite a bit of experience in taking different kinds of designs through the FDA, through design and through the FDA. Lisa is going to talk about from a test perspective. Many a times people think, well, by the time we do fatigue testings, fatigue testing is a slow process, 10 million cycles at 2 hertz, it goes on forever, we don't need to do that. Lisa will talk about a lot of ways that you can preempt that thing and jump through that hurdle relatively quickly. And then, of course, we have Ryan. Many of you may not know Ryan, but I've known Ryan for many, many years. Ryan has a very strong background in additive R&D and in manufacturing R&D, so manufacturing of additive. So Ryan is going to talk about that from that perspective. And then I'll be writing questions. I hope you'll write questions, and we'll discuss all this. Okay, that's Linkotech. Thank you.
There we go. Thanks, Mukesh. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be discussing, talking about how our process that we went through for designing a novel orthopedic device through a case study. And I'm going to talk about our process in determining whether or not additive was appropriate. So I'm going to talk through the implants and then the instruments, and then kind of wrap up with some market opportunities I see for additive. So the goal for this project, which many other platforms like it, right? We need to have mechanical strength as number one. The manufacturing process needs to be stable and repeatable, and it needs to be cost effective, right? It needs to make sense. So this particular device had 4 components. It had a cage, a locking plate, screws, and anchors. So the cage made a lot of sense for additive. The geometry itself, kind of the porosity, the organic shape to it, made a lot of sense, and within my experience, I felt like we could hold up or design a cage that would hold up to the mechanical strength requirements. But the biggest thing was from a cost standpoint and the osseointegration that additive can allow, it just made a lot of sense. So now moving on to the plate. For an additive plate, we were apprehensive because we had unknown testing requirements via the FDA, and also internally, it was something that we hadn't done before. And from a cost standpoint, it just didn't necessarily make sense. So we ended up going with traditional manufacturing for the plate. On the screw, really just came down to a cost deal, where it was a lot more cost effective to go with something tried and true. And then finally, the anchor, really, this is something that was going to be novel regardless. And so the FDA actually, through our Q submission, prescribed to us a few additional tests beyond what would be standard for this type of device for us to evaluate the anchors. And it really left an opportunity where additive could make sense, because in quoting it out, the additive cost for these particular implants was actually advantageous. What ended up holding us up in going with additive on these anchors was the fact that there was an additional cost involved with sterile packing, and then the logistical hurdle in making that all work. It just wasn't going to be seamless or what we wanted to focus on for this particular piece. So now on to the instrumentation, same goals. Most instruments you're going to see are like what I call the freehand inserter, where it's a long cannulated shaft, and then you have a long threaded post, straightforward stuff. And so that doesn't necessarily lend itself to additive manufacturing. It's something that's tried and true. We know the performance. However, the guided inserter was something where we saw an opportunity. So surgeons have expressed to us, multiple times that they don't like using guided inserters because they're too bulky, the instruments stick out too much, they can't see the implant. All of these issues really allowed additive to shine. And so that's why we ended up going with a hybrid inserter. So the actual guided portion itself is additively manufactured, and then it's integrated into what, welded onto the cannulated shaft that's traditionally manufactured. So we've gone through, within this case study, a series of different applications. I think you can generally say that within orthopedics, you've got screws, nails, plates, constructs very generally, and then instruments. And so now what I want to talk about is, some ways that I can see the additive manufacturing industry improving in a way to be able to hit, why can we not hit some of these areas? So namely, of course, the talk is fatigue hurdles, right? So I'm going to talk about fatigue challenges, and then moving through, high quality and some software integration that I'd like to see in the future. So for fatigue challenges, right, a big advantage of additive manufacturing is that roughened surface. But of course, that's then going to cause a lower strength in the part. So that's something that I think that Ryan will touch on, where we can improve on that, and it may even be advantageous potentially as we improve on additive processes in the future. So what I want to focus on here is high quality machines matter. And what do I mean by that? Partially, I mean, I want the parts to be a consistent, reproducible, stable output. And as part of that, from a design standpoint, I'm seeing a wide range in my test values, and I'd like that to, zone in a bit better, if possible. So post-production improvements, what I mean by this is known internal and external testing requirements, which I don't consider myself an expert in additive manufacturing. I'm not the person actually running the machines. It would be fantastic if in the future the market can give us even more support in that regard, which ties into my final slide here, where it would be optimal to be able to have a more seamless, concerted and congruent software design interface where you're able to take, I can take my CAD software, what I've designed, and before we've even produced a part, run it through, and determine whether or not, how is this going to shrink through the additive process and after HIP, and then can we offset those all the way back up to my end before even producing a part. So that's what I see in terms of the areas of improvement. I guess this kind of turned into a bit of my wish list. But to summarize here, it really comes down to, it's as simple as this for additive, from what I see, is that you need to have the mechanical strength, you need to have stable and repeatable process, and of course it needs to make sense from a cost effectiveness standpoint. So, thank you. I'm gonna turn it over to
Thanks. So I'm going to address a lot of the issues we can see testing, but we also need to think about the environment we're putting these implants into. And there's a lot of design issues and pros and cons with respect to that interaction between additive manufacturing and the implant's design as well. And I'll end with some quality and regulatory information. But we all know that additive manufacturing is the process of joining the materials in a layered fashion taken from CAD 3D modeling. But the beauty behind it is we're able to build these complex matrices with open porosities, open architectures that can be graded from a dense to a very porous surface, starting with a dense core. And we can have repetitive microstructures, as shown in the figure below, where we've got microstructures within microstructures, where we can increase that surface area significantly for better efficiency with fluid or thermal transfers. As with any technology, there's good and bad. There's advantages such as being able to create these structures, complicated structures, out of different types of materials in a rapid fashion, and also being able to customize the surfaces and grading these different densities, so you're not using coatings, you're just creating it all in one printed design. But also being able to create structures that mimic the biology, what we call biomimicry. With that, though, there's always disadvantages. A lot of your performance of that design can be affected by the speed of the build, which can alter its integrity, mechanical integrity. The tolerances are not as tight, so you have to make sure you're validating those lots. You could have internal voids due to the build, the speed, and you can have powder degradation or contamination. But I use this when I'm teaching at medical conferences to surgeons, that 3D printing is actually the vehicle or the tool that allows us to make these complex designs. So that to have successful processes and the products, it really requires that combination of the manufacturing process of AM combined with the designs and the materials and the environment it concerns and the build process and quality system. So thinking about factors that can influence the mechanical integrity of the AM devices, you have to think about the design of the implant. Do you have an internal open lattice structure? Maybe the walls of that lattice are too weak, so that when it fails, it could be catastrophic. What is the stress distribution, not just of the outside shell, but you need to understand, how does the stress transfer through that lattice structure, perhaps internally? The surface geometries can also alter the performance. Everything can be altered in a good way and a negative way as well. But these geometries and treatments and textures can basically enhance bone apposition, but you can have things such as point loading. And finally, think about the tissue integrity, the environment you're putting it into. Is it so robust? Or if it does fail, is it so much debris that it can cause harm to that local bone or local tissue? And understand and validate your manufacturing processes and equipment, and have a robust quality system. So just talking about the quality system very briefly is, first you have to qualify that equipment as part of that system. And we do that through an IQ, OQ, PQ system where you have your installation qualification, your operational qualification. Can you produce samples to spec? And then can you scale up to much larger supply? And can you revalidate your performance qualification if the designs of that structure may change, the lattice may change, for instance? Then you need to think about qualifying your manufacturing process. This is very important as well. You need to ensure that your results are repeatable. You need to provide these detailed process maps. If they change, you need to document that within your system for your operational procedures. Characterize your powder and test the integrity of the powder over time. A lot of folks will mix that powder. So you need to make sure you can characterize it and test it and ensure that you're going to get repeatability with your product or your coupons. Design and implement your V&V system. Have that in place, obviously. Also do a complete risk assessment for the many different avenues of the processes and the equipment, and design risk mitigation tests. Do that in-house. Build multi-layer matrices of a build plate with different orientations, multiple powder batches, different lots, and evaluate through testing, chemical and mechanical, that worst case build. So taking the implants at the worst case positions of the build within the matrix. So we'll take this to really thinking about using AM, especially in implants, orthopedic implants. How do we address the biomechanical challenges as well from a test perspective? It all plays together, not only the processing, but the implant and the tissue it'll sit in. We've already discussed some of the design advantages with the open architecture and the roughened surfaces, and we're going to get into that a little bit later of things that can happen when you're testing and need to think about in your design. But you can also design devices where you can tailor that elastic modulus of the device. Well, what does that mean? You can take bulk piece of titanium and have a completely open architecture, different thicknesses of your struts or cross members within that implant, and you can create a more elastic or less stiff device. You can design a metal to perform like a polymer or to perform equivalent from an elastic modulus perspective to that of bone, which is a good thing. However, the more open that structure may be, the greater the compromise and potential strength you may have. So applying this and other thoughts to orthopedic fixation, that's what we know. Our main goal when we think about orthopedic fixation is basically, how do we improve the interface? How do we get osseointegration? If we get osseointegration into this implant, we have earlier stability, potentially earlier healing. However, the more open you make that structure, the more you can actually compromise its strength, its stiffness, its performance. So these are things you need to think about in that design, because we see that when we test it. So we talk about these different design factors. I want to focus on the stress distribution assessment and the surface texture. We've kind of talked about open architecture. So how does stress distribution affect the potential fatigue or the mechanical integrity of these types of devices? Well, if you don't understand how that stress is distributed through an implant, through validated finite element analyses, potentially there's other ways to assess that as well, then you're not going to understand how it'll run out or how it'll fail. If you want to shorten your length of time of your testing, and you can do a lot of that through we do a lot of feasibility testing, but also having these validated models. What do I mean by validated? Design your FEA so that, if possible, make them nonlinear models and have them validated with actual tests so that you can incorporate that back into your model. Understand how you can model that lattice, that internal lattice, because what happens is, in fatigue, sometimes you can have a failure that's a domino effect. If you've got a lattice with thin walls, you can't model it, you've only modeled the outer rim, it could fail miserably. It could fail like a saltine cracker where it'll just shred and you'll have excessive debris. So you really need to understand, how will this stress transfer? And we've kind of done this with some devices. I'm using exemplar spinal cages where we could actually map that if we change the strut thicknesses, we change the height, dimensions, that we get different stress patterns, but we were seeing it throughout the implant and deep within. With respect to the surface textures, they're great. Bone loves titanium, bone loves roughened surfaces. It's been shown through different studies that an increased coefficient of friction that is increased will also increase the resistance to device migration. Great with cages, great with cervical cages. However, you need to understand about that surface. If it's too rough, if your peaks and valleys are too high, too deep, you risk potential debris, breakage of these peaks and valleys into the surrounding bone. That's bad. Again, think about the tissue interface. Think about what'll happen if that sheds more debris. But that texture can also stimulate cell behavior. We call it mechanotransduction, where you can provide this mechanical stimuli from the texture and convert that mechanical energy, or the cells will convert the mechanical energy into electric or biochemical signals. But things to think about. Rough surfaces are great, but during a test, you can also point load because a lot of these surfaces are not consistent with their peaks and valleys. So sometimes you may have a point load, and that's more artifactual. You have to make sure you understand, okay, we had a fatigue failure. It's just like having a notch fatigue in a piece of titanium. Is it real or is it an artifact? And finally, I'll end with some regulatory considerations. The FDA wants to see that you've done your homework and you can provide them with design and manufacturing requirements where you're addressing the fulfillment of that quality system and you're providing this system to the FDA with respect to the device's printed design, the software workflow, the materials control, the post-processing, and the validation and acceptance activities, as well as that data that's been put into, that V&V data, the validation work, into your quality system. From the manufacturing processing side, they also want you to make sure that you can, from the device side itself, they want to make sure that you provide the device description. Understand that description. What about the mechanical testing? Have you addressed not only the device itself, but you're also going to do coupon testing for your manufacturing process that would be required by the FDA as well. Assess the dimensional measurements. Where are your tolerances? Are they within that range? Although it's a broader range, are they within it? What about the material characterization as well? The cleaning and the sterilization biocomp is for your 510Ks. So in conclusion, we've seen that successful printed implants actually employ this critical analysis of the structural failures for the products as well as the successes. We always want to understand, how is this going to run out? But you also need to understand, how is it going to fail? Is it catastrophic failure? Is it failing at unrealistic supraphysiological loads? Or is it failing at borderline, this could be a problem? Conduct your IQ, OQ, PQs, and reiterate those PQ processes over time. Have an advanced quality management system, have folks with decades of experience, such as these gentlemen here, strong collaboration with other industries, and listen to the regulatory requirements. Do your homework and make sure you have everything for your submission for both the processes, validation work, as well as the device. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name's Ryan Kircher. Bear with me, I might be losing my voice a little bit, but I'm gonna do my best. I work for an RMS company. I'm a senior additive manufacturing engineer. We're a contract manufacturer of metal implantable devices, and one of our offerings is additive manufacturing, primarily of Ti-6 for medical devices. So I'm gonna kind of go into some details about the metallurgy of the parts we're making. And kind of talk about what our capabilities, not just RMS's capabilities, but I would say the additive manufacturing community's ability to manufacture products and how that relates to their fatigue performance. One thing I kind of want to really kind of talk about is the difference between fatigue strength and fatigue performance, right? So fatigue strength is really the bulk material strength of a material, right? Typically evaluated using standards that try to eliminate a lot of other variability that could influence the results. Those are typically done on like highly polished samples and stuff so that we can really focus on the bulk material of the properties, right? And then there's fatigue performance, which is how much fatigue your device can actually withstand in its operating conditions. And the reason I kind of want to differentiate between the two is because there's things we can do with our additive processes to influence the fatigue strength of the material, but it's much harder to influence the fatigue performance of an additive device through processing, and I kind of want to go through what creates that situation. So let's talk about the bulk fatigue properties of Ti-6.4. A lot of you guys are probably familiar with ROT Ti-6.4 and its fatigue performances, and typically there's two grades of Ti-6.4. There's grade 23, extra low interstitial Ti-6.4, and then grade 5, which allows for additional interstitial elements in the material. And in general, grade 23 was developed as an alloy that had better fatigue performance than grade 5 because of those lower interstitial elements, right? And those were typically wrought and cast materials. And in general, you can kind of predict the bulk fatigue strength of a material based on its strength and its hardness, perhaps, right? So we have all these kind of perceptions about how things like oxygen content and heat treatments can affect the fatigue strength of Ti-6.4 based on all the information we know from years of history with ROT. But those don't necessarily correlate to additive manufactured Ti-6.4. The graph up here is a really good example, right? One of the rules of thumb is as oxygen content in the material increases, the fatigue strength should go down, right? But in general, the strength actually increases. And you can see here that if you looked at just this particular study, there seems to be an optimal amount of oxygen at 0.17 in which you get the best fatigue performance. At higher oxygen, you actually get worse fatigue performance. And at low oxygen, you actually get worse performance. So just because we have these rules of thumb for wrought and cast materials that we're used to, they don't necessarily correlate to additively manufactured Ti-6.4. And that's typically because we have a pretty unique microstructure coming out of our additively manufactured process, right? Let's talk a little bit about static mechanical properties and how they relate to fatigue strength, right? So as Mukesh pointed out earlier, there's this perception that additively manufactured Ti-6.4 is weak. In reality, you have a lot of influence on what the strength of that material can be, and generally it's pretty strong. We struggle to actually produce parts at the ASTM minimums, right? You can see the minimum strengths here and our averages and our process capability. In general, we're about 4 standard deviations above the ASTM 3001 requirements for mechanical strength, right? So additively manufactured Ti-6.4 can be quite strong. Let's talk about ways that we can actually influence what those static strengths are, right? One of the best ways to manipulate the strength of additively manufactured Ti-6.4 is by changing its oxygen content, right? So lower oxygen content typically results in lower yield and tensile strengths, and as that increases, generally the yield and tensile strengths increase. One of the interesting things about additive manufacturing is that the chemical composition is constantly changing as we recycle and reuse powder, right? For this to be an economic process, we need to recycle and reuse our powder over and over again. Most systems allow you to do that numerous times. You can see this graph here. This is a specific powder batch that was reused for nearly a half a year, right? And over time, it increased in oxygen content. And as a result, its yield strength increased over time as well, right? So you can see from this graph, let me look real closely here. You can get almost 100 MPa, 10% difference in yield and tensile strength from the first time you use that powder until the time you decided to retire it, right? So that's a pretty significant change in mechanical properties. Another way that we can manipulate the mechanical properties of additively manufactured Ti-6.4 is through heat treatments. One of the predominant ways that we do that is hot isostatic pressing today. I would say the vast majority of the products we make undergo hot isostatic pressing. You look at the specification for hipping in ASTM F3001, it's a pretty large window, right? It allows for anywhere from 2 to 4 hours in the hip furnace, and you can vary the temperature by 100 degrees, right? In practicality, the hip vendors want to make as much money as they can, so they typically do it at the lowest temperature for the shortest amount of time, so that their expenditures are less, right? But what happens if you actually hip something at the top end of that cycle, right? You can get quite a change in microstructure. That extra time and temperature coarsens the microstructure quite a bit. You get quite a bit of grain growth. And we talk about hipping and what it does, right? For additive manufacturing, it kind of accomplishes 3 main goals. It can help you reduce residual stresses in your material. It can help you refine your microstructure. And then hipping can actually help eliminate internal defects in your parts, right? Hipping won't improve your surface finish or remove any sort of defects that are on the surface of your part, but if there are small microvoids in your part, it can help push those out. Vacuum stress relief, on the other hand, will help with residual stresses and microstructure refinement, but it won't help you with those defects. So what happens when we change those hipping parameters? I did some studies where I used Quintus helped me out with a couple of these studies and a couple of my other vendors where we did hot isostatically press parts at different times and temperatures. And what we saw is that we can get upwards of 50 or 60 MPa variation in yield and tensile strength performance, depending on what we use for hipping parameters, right? So you combine hipping and oxygen content and ask yourself, like, how can I influence the static mechanical properties of Ti-6.4? You can kind of see here, I did some calculations on what the worst case and best case for yield and tensile strength would be out of our material. And you can see you can get like nearly a 20% difference in mechanical performance just by altering the heat treatment and chemical composition of the material you're taking. But this is, I think, the most important slide in my deck. Does that really matter? Right? Does it really matter that we can manipulate the strength, static mechanical strength of material pretty significantly? We can also, to a certain extent, alter the fatigue strength of the material. But how does that translate to fatigue performance of the devices that we're trying to make? This graph here on the right shows a family of, I wish I had a pointer. It's 4 different groups of fatigue bars. 2 that were highly polished with different static mechanical properties, and then some that are as printed with the surface roughness. And what it shows is that the surface roughness of the tensile bar, or of the fatigue bars, totally overwhelm any differences in the actual fatigue strength of the material, right? So that surface roughness and the as printed small micro cracks and stuff on the surface are what dominate the fatigue performance of additively manufactured Ti-6.4. So what does all that mean? I mean, it means that we have the ability to manipulate static mechanical properties and fatigue properties. But at the end of the day, what's really going to drive how well an additively manufactured product performs in fatigue is its design, its surface roughness, and its stress condition, right? I think Lisa kind of hit on that pretty significantly, right? If one of the advantages of additive manufacturing, almost everything that we make at RMS has some sort of roughened or lattice structure on it, right? And that inherently is what will control your fatigue performance instead of these manipulations that you can have in fatigue strength. So if we really want to try to figure out ways of improving the fatigue performance of additively manufactured devices, we need to think about ways of intelligently designing implants so that areas that have high stress concentrations don't have rough surfaces, or working on advanced techniques to improve the surface finish of the parts in some sort of post-processing technique. I think that's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan, Lisa, John. So I have been scribbling a lot of notes. So I learned a lot today. I hope you guys have been taking your questions down. So are there questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
So you saw the effect of, hip had a small effect, surface finish obviously had a much larger effect there. But if you were to compare those results in the same surface finish conditions, let's say polished, versus a wrought or forged or, a different, starting fabricated form of Ti-6-4, how big is the penalty that you still see for additive manufacturing? Laser powder bed fusion, I guess, in this case.
I'm reluctant to answer that question because I did that about 14 years ago when I was really first trying to start understanding additive, and there was a hit, and it was probably at that time I want to say like 20-30% for like identical as polished coupons from a wrought bar and additively manufactured Ti-6-4. I feel like that's probably changed significantly in the last 12 years. And I would also point out that was like done using very standard hip parameters and standard oxygen content. So I think there are opportunities to show equivalent or even better fatigue strength via additive by manipulating oxygen content and finding ideal hip parameters. But ultimately, if your design still has a rough and crack-sensitive surface, I'm not sure it's really worth going through all that effort, if that makes sense.
So Ryan, if you don't mind, I'll add to that. So you're correct. Ryan is correct. If let's say you go back and look at data, say 20 years back, 15 years back, you would see almost 25, 30, maybe 40% decrease. But since then, people have learned, or the world of additive has learned, that oxygen and microstructure plays a big role, even if the surface finish is the same. Since then, newer data where people are talking about what is the oxygen content and all that, things have started improving because they're using the right kind of alloy powder for that application, okay? But even today, I'm not going to stand over here and say it is exactly like wrought. It is not. And the difference is still microstructure that you get out of additive is not exactly wrought microstructure, okay? So that does still play a role. However, with newer knowledge of heat treatment, lots of things are changing. So yes, if you have time to play around with it, which people like Ryan are working on, my team is working on, I guarantee you 2-3 years from now, we would have, come neck to neck to it. Yeah. Good question though. Any other questions? Come on, there's a huge crowd. There has to be questions. Well, maybe I'll ask questions. So this is a question for you.
Yes, there is a question.
Yeah, you got one right there.
Okay.
Sorry, hi. Just a question around the oxygen content. So you basically talked about higher oxygen content is better in terms of strength. And I was just wondering, do you have a comment on the kind of like regulatory side of where oxygen content is supposed to be? So like for instance in F3000, in F3001 it's a limit of like say 0.13. And have I think you mentioned limits higher than that. So have you any comments on maybe why it's at that level or if it should be looked at or reviewed from a regulatory side? And I also was wondering with your studies related to oxygen, did you consider other factors like the powder size distribution or changing chemistry of the powder or anything like that?
Brian, do you want to take it or should I answer? Well, this is the...
I'll comment. Like, first of all, sorry for, those were not my SN curves. Those were things I pulled from the literature. But I've done these types of studies as well. But to your point, what is ASTM F3001 is 0.13% oxygen maximum. Grade 5 is 0.2, right? All of those are additive manufactured specs, right? Those values were just stolen from wrought and other conventional specs, right? That's where those values came from. Nobody sat there and said, what is the right oxygen content for additive manufactured Ti-6-4? Do I think personally that 0.13% oxygen is the best value to give you best fatigue performance at I-6-4? Absolutely not. I have a feeling it's quite a bit higher. I don't know what it is. I haven't been able to put all the resources into figuring that out.
So I am going to answer your question, and I will probably date myself by answering that question. So in the medical industry, there are many products out which are sintered titanium with oxygen level as high as 0.35. Okay? Now, if you go back to aerospace, where all Ti-6-4 alloy comes from, in the aerospace literature, you will see strength with oxygen graph at around 0.35 or maybe 0.4. You start seeing a decrease in yield strength. Okay, so but there is a standard. If you comply with standards, the number of questions you're going to get asked from regulatory group is relatively less. A standard doesn't mean that you cannot break that thing. You can. Case in point, me. Yes, Regenerex had a slightly higher oxygen, but you need to justify and you need to demonstrate that. Okay. So, any other questions? Yes, please.
I'm gonna head back here with the mic. I just need to quickly interject that we do have another session that starts at 3:15, so this might have to be.
Okay, well, I have lots of questions. Okay.
I know. This has been great. I'm gonna hand this over to you, Victor.
All right, so we have a question about like the fatigue of the additive, like any post-processing other than just, polishing. Like we're thinking, flash electropolish or type 2 anodize. Will that have an effect as well? That's better than just pure polishing, or is it more weighted towards maybe like lattice design and gradient of lattice?
So the question is post-processing, for example, type 2 anodizing, does that change fatigue properties, and could that be something used?
It'll change the fatigue performance, but not the fatigue strength, right?
Right, yeah.
But that's only if you get down to the valleys within that structure, right? So you have to remove all of the additive surface from that part, right? Because you think about where that fatigue crack's likely going to start. It's probably going to start at one of the deeper valleys on that surface, right? So, if you're looking for a really high fatigue performance from like a polished surface that you would expect from rot, you basically got to be able to not know that part was additively manufactured. If you look at it, you can tell it's still additively manufactured. You probably still have surface effects that are going to affect your performance.
So I'm going to ask a question, and this goes to John and Lisa. By the way, let me know how we are doing. One more question?
Just need to wrap up a little bit.
5 minutes, okay. We will do all this question in 5 minutes, okay? So Lisa, you brought a very good point, stress distribution, right? So my question to John is, when you're designing an implant, right, have you considered, or do you all consider during the design, not just the solid, but the porous structure and how it is affecting stress distribution and its effect on fatigue properties? And for example, you do a fatigue test and you realize that this is the breaking point. Maybe it is better to reduce porous structure from there or change roughness from there. Is that a part of your design consideration?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Absolutely.
100%. I mean, you just saw the FEA, that was up there of the ALIF cage, right? So that was an earlier design that had a lot more open space and had a lot more porosity to it. There was a lot less kind of solid strut moving through it.
Okay.
And although it tested adequately, it didn't test the way that I wanted it to, and so I went back and actually added in more solid strut.
More structure over there. Okay. So this is an interesting approach that John said. John had come up with his idea of his porous structure wherever. He did an FEA analysis. He saw some things that he was not happy about, and he removed porous structure, right? Yep. So one of the things that I tell people is that when you're designing, make sure that your solid material without the porous can withstand what you intend for it to do. Then take some material away in your design iteration when you're doing FEA analysis, right? And see that will it still take the mechanical properties, the fatigue performance that you're looking at? If those two things pass, which is relatively easy to do because you're doing you're doing it on the FEA, then throw in the porous structure. Lisa, what would you say to that? Is that a relatively good approach or is that a disaster?
I would say that's an excellent approach, and I would caution everyone to, again, we always do feasibility testing in situations like this. And just because an implant did well under static, quasi-static loading does not mean it is going to survive or be successful with the fatigue test, especially if it's a spinal cage where you're going to 5 million cycles. So really understanding that internal structure, how it'll perform under repetitive loading, it's not a linear relationship between your static and your fatigue. If you took an IM nail, that's much easier to be able to predict the fatigue performance. But when you're looking at intricate structures, multiple components, multiple densities, porosities, surface structures, it's much more complicated.
Any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'll have one last question. So Ryan, I'm a material scientist, metallurgist by training, and the correlations of oxygen and strength that you talked about, are these relatively new literature that you can let the team know where to, or the audience know where they can use that? So as they plan their validations or their design approach, they could consider that, or you think, don't waste your time on it? So we were talking about oxygen content.
Yeah.
Right? As a potential parameter that has an effect on strength and therefore fatigue performance, right? So now a design engineer comes to you and says, hey, you know what, I want to design this. Would you impose on manufacturing, even though you have R&D and manufacturing both, that for his design, you cannot do more than 0.19 or whatever? Or you think we should not go down that path?
I don't think we should go down that path.
Okay, that is a very interesting question.
I'm a contract manufacturer. I want flexibility in manufacturing, but I think I want that because it's best for everybody. But at the end of the day, I honestly don't think it really matters, right? It really does come down to the surface effects and stuff of the design. I don't think that oxygen content, although it does have a big impact on the static mechanical properties, doesn't have a huge impact on fatigue strength. But you do have to take that into account when you're talking about your process window, your validation. One of the things that's very important for people to realize today is that if you are going to go and do device testing on a part, you're required to do mechanical static testing along with those parts and provide all of that information to the FDA for clearance. And the strength of the material that you use to make those devices will be controlled, right? So if you use high oxygen powder with high strength to make the devices that you're going to do the testing with the FDA, they'll leverage a relatively high oxygen content and high strength on you in production. So if you are going to make devices that are going to undergo fatigue performance for device clearance, it's very important to try to use low oxygen powder with low mechanical properties to make those parts so that you have a feasible processing window when you move to production.
Very good point, very good point. And I second that because I'm in contract manufacturing. Many of our customers say their design group or somebody in quality has said oxygen level needs to be this much or this range, and we want to be better than the ASTM standard. It starts adding up in dollars and costs. So your procurement department will not be happy. Anyway, with that, I am going to close this session.
Many thanks to you, Mukesh, for moderating.
Thank you. I didn't do anything.
Obviously, there is a lot to be said, and we wish we had more time. But we want to thank you. We want to thank John, Lisa, and Ryan as well. And you might want to say a few words as well, but go ahead.
Well, okay, for the OMTEC team, thank you for doing this. I was reluctant. I didn't think this would draw so much of crowd. I'm happy I did this. I'm happy about it. But guys, do not be worried or do not be scared about taking on fatigue properties, okay? Like Ryan said, fatigue strength on a rotating bar is one thing. Fatigue performance on your implant is how you design, how you test, how you manufacture. Everything all goes together. You can break this. I know my team is working on hip stems. and we are testing some pretty interesting performances. If I can do it, I'm sure you guys can do it.
Thank you so much for your participation, all of you. And let's give a round of applause to our wonderful panel here today. Thank you so much. Obviously, it was a nice draw, so thank you so much. Have a great day.